Good morning, Year 3. So today we're going to be reading chapters 2 and 3 of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And what we're going to try and do is every Monday we're going to have a Vipers lesson. Okay, so we'll be reading either 1 or 2 chapters of the book, and then you'll be answering some Vipers questions on what you have just read. I will also upload and attach to the email the chapters that we read as a PDF as well. So if you have a printer at home, you might want to print it off, or you can just read it on a tablet or a laptop, whatever device you're doing your learning from. So you've got that instead of you going back at watching this video and hearing me read it. Okay, so Chapter 2, Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say good night. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shrivelled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe, and Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up, and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something they looked forward to all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other. And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever." "Clever!" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above, I don't know what's the matter with me. Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please?" "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvellous way to grow quite young again, and all his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka!" cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of chocolate bars, each with a different centre, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything that other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine. "And he sends them to all the 4 corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, it is, and to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only chocolate bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he has invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the refrigerator? You can even lie it leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day, and it won't go runny." "But that's impossible," said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. "Of course it's impossible," cried Grandpa Joe. "It's completely absurd. But Mr. Willy Wonka has done it." "Quite right," the others agreed, nodding their heads. "Mr. Wonka has done it." And then again Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. "Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets, and rich caramels that change colour every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and sugar balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And, by a most secret method, he can make a lovely blue bird's eggs with black spots on them, and when you put one of these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue." Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it," he said. "Mine too," said little Charlie, "but please go on." While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door, listening. "Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince," said Grandma Josephine. "He'd like to hear that." "You mean Prince Pondicherry?" said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. "Completely dotty," said Grandpa George. "But very rich," said Grandma Georgina. "What did he do?" asked Charlie eagerly. "Listen," said Grandpa Joe, "and I'll tell you." Chapter 3, Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. "Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka," said Grandpa Joe, "and asked him to come all the way out to India and build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate." "Did Mr. Wonka do it, Grandpa?" "He did indeed, and what a palace it was! It had 100 rooms, and everything was made of either dark or light chocolate. The bricks were chocolate, and the cement holding them together was chocolate, and the windows were chocolate, and all the walls and ceilings were made of chocolate. So were the carpets and the pictures and the furniture and the beds, and when you turned on the taps in the bathroom, hot chocolate came pouring out." When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, "I warn you, though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating it right away." "Nonsense!" shouted the prince. "I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it." But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this there came a very hot day with a boiling sun, and the whole palace began to melt, and then it sank slowly to the ground, and the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke up to find himself swimming around in a huge brown sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was bright, and his eyes were stretched so wide you could see the whites all around. "Is all this really true?" he asked, "or are you pulling my leg?" "It's true!" cried all 4 of the old people at once. "Of course it's true. Ask anyone you like. And I'll tell you something else that's true," said Grandpa Joe, and now he leaned closer to Charlie and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. "Nobody ever comes out." "Out of where?" asked Charlie. "And nobody ever goes in." "In where?" cried Charlie. "Wonka's factory, of course." "Grandpa, what do you mean?" "I mean workers, Charlie. Workers." "All factories," said Grandpa Joe, "have workers streaming in and out of the gates in the mornings and evenings, except Wonka's. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place or coming out?" Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the 4 old faces, one after the other, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There was no sign of joking or leg pulling on any of them. "Well, have you?" asked Grandpa Joe. I really don't know, Grandpa, Charlie stammered. Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed. Exactly, said Grandpa Joe, but there must be people working there. Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyway. Then who? Cried Charlie. Aha! That's it, you see. That's another of Mr. Willy Wonka's cleverness. Charlie, dear, Mrs. Bucket called out from where she was standing by the door. It's time for bed. That's enough for tonight. But, Mother, I must hear tomorrow, my darling. That's right, said Grandpa Joe. I'll tell you the rest of it tomorrow evening. Okay, so this is the sheet that you will get sent today in your emails, and it's also on the website of your Vipers questions. So as you can see, you've got some questions for vocabulary, some for infer, some for predict. You've only got one for explain, some for retrieve, and you've got one for summarize, okay? So today we're going to go through some questions that I have got myself. So these are the questions. These questions are not on your sheet today. They're different ones. But I just thought we'd go through it and explain how to answer them. Okay, so we're going to start off with our vocabulary questions, and we've got two questions here. Well, the first one is, what is a prune? So some of you may already know what a prune is. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the actually I'll go on to the PDF version so you can see. Okay, here. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes. Okay, so Roald Dahl, the author, has used a simile here. He has said that the old people were as shriveled as prunes. So the question that we're asking is, what is a prune? So I have already pre-Googled searched this. So obviously if you know what a prune is, you wouldn't go onto Google, but I thought I would show you how to do if you're not sure on what it is. Okay, so a prune is a dried plum. So a plum is a fruit, and a prune is also a fruit. It's just a dried version of a plum. Okay, so I'm going to start off with my full sentences. A prune is a dried plum. Okay, nice and simple, but that answers the question straight away. Okay, next one then is, it says define absurd. Absurd. Okay, so last week we had another question that asked us to define a word. So it's define the definition of that word. Okay, so again I have gone on to Google and I have put in the meaning of absurd. So absurd means it is wildly unreasonable, illogical or inappropriate. Okay, so let's see if we can find absurd in the text. I'm sure it was talking about Mr. Willy Wonka. Let's see if we can have a quick scan and whether we can find him. I'm sure that we was talking about Mr. Willy Wonka being extremely dotty and crazy. Here we go. Of course it's impossible, cried Grandpa Joe. It's completely absurd. Okay, so absurd means it is unreasonable. So it's not really true. It can't happen. Okay, so absurd means something is unreasonable. Something that cannot logically happen. Okay, here we go. Okay, so please try and answer your questions using full sentences as you would at school. Okay, now we're going to go on to an infer question. How do the public view Willy Wonka? So here I've got a section of the text where we're talking about Mr. Willy Wonka. Okay, so the grandparents are really bigging up Mr. Willy Wonka. They are saying that he is the cleverest chocolate maker in the world. He is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that. So the question is asking you, how do the public view Willy Wonka? So the public view Willy Wonka as an extraordinary man because the text states, the text tells us, the text tells me that everybody should know how amazing he is. He is, and then because people are always talking about how amazing he is, okay, so the public have high expectations of Willy Wonka. Okay, so that's basically saying that because he's so amazing, the public know that he's so amazing. They've got high expectations of him, okay, and they always keep saying how wonderful he is. Okay, so please remember to use the text to answer your questions, okay? So you might want to highlight the words that you were going to use in your answer, okay? So here I'm just highlighting all of the adjectives that Grandpa Joe uses to describe Mr. Willy Wonka, okay? Let's go on to another info question then. What is strange about the chocolate factory? Okay, so this was the last part that we read about the chocolate factory. So what is so strange about the chocolate factory? And it's the part where Mr. Willy Wonka, Grandpa Joe whispered, "Nobody ever comes out." Okay, and then Charlie said, "Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed." So what is strange about the chocolate factory? So the chocolate factory is strange because the gates are always closed and no workers are seen to go in or out of the factory. Okay, so that is what I'm inferring from this text, that it is strange because none of the workers go in or out and the gates are always closed. Okay, so I've used the text to help me structure my answer. Okay then, so let's go to a retrieve ones. Remember, this is just basic retrieving questions. So just literally finding the answer in the text and copying it into our answer. Okay, so what was the name of the Indian prince? Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka. So I know that the name of the Indian prince is Prince Pondicherry. Okay, nice and simple there. That was a lovely, easy question. And then our next retrieve is, what did Prince Pondicherry want Willy Wonka to do? So, and asked him to come all the way out to India and build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. So, Prince Pondicherry wanted Willy Wonka to go all the way out to India to build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. Okay, so I have used exactly what the text has said in my answer. He wanted Willy Wonka to go all the way out to India, build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. Okay, so we have answered some vocabulary, some inference, and some retrieval questions there. Okay, so I hope that you have a really good try answering the rest of those questions that is on your sheet, and that you have a super day. Please email myself or Mr. Grocott if you need any help, and we will try our best to get back to you as soon as we can to help you all out. Have a great day. Speak to you all soon. Bye.